Was Jesus married? Now, that's a question that really seems to challenge centuries of tradition, doesn't it? In this explainer, we're going to dive into the work of scholar William E. Phipps. And just to be clear, we're not looking for a simple yes or no. Instead, we want to understand what the question itself reveals about history, culture, and, the way faith itself can change over time. So let's get right into it. This isn't just some modern speculation. The argument, as laid out by Phipps, is that this very question is deeply, deeply rooted in the historical and cultural world of Jesus' own time. The idea is, if you really want to understand his life, you first have to understand his world. Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to follow Phipps's line of reasoning. We'll kick things off by looking at the cultural norms of the first century. Then we'll trace how a major theological shift elevated celibacy. We'll also be fair and look at some critiques of his argument. And finally, we'll get into why this question is actually so significant, even today. So let's start with the central idea here. The goal isn't sensationalism, not at all. It's really about a serious attempt at historical reconstruction. It's like peeling back all these layers of tradition to see what we can learn about the person underneath. Now, Phipps is careful. He doesn't come out and say he has the definitive answer. Instead, his work poses a fascinating question. What if the cultural world of first-century Judaism actually points to a different story than the one we've inherited? He's basically inviting us to set aside later theology for a moment and try to meet the man in his original setting. And this brings us right to the heart of Phipps's argument. The world he asks us to step into. It's a place with some profoundly different social expectations, especially when it came to marriage. To really get the argument, you have to get the culture. And in first-century Judaism, marriage wasn't just a personal choice or about romance. It was a powerful, community-wide expectation. I mean, it was seen as a sacred duty, something woven into the very fabric of daily life. So Phipps really hammers this point home. In this world, lifelong celibacy was a radical exception. It would have been a really remarkable status that would have demanded some kind of explanation. To remain unmarried meant you were swimming against a very powerful social and religious current. So here's the core of it. If Jesus was unmarried, that would have been a huge departure from the norm. And Phipps argues the silence of the Gospels on this topic is, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Was his marriage just so normal that nobody bothered to mention it, or was his celibacy an unspoken but very noticeable anomaly? Okay, so if marriage was the absolute norm, how on earth did the ideal of a celibate Jesus become so central to Christian theology? Well, Phipps points to a major shift in thinking as Christianity began to move from its Jewish roots into the wider Greco-Roman world. And this slide just lays out the tension perfectly. Phipps argues that as Christianity spread, it started absorbing these Hellenistic or Greek philosophies that were often pretty hostile to the body and to sexuality. You see this deep suspicion of the physical world and a praise of virginity as a higher spiritual state began to take hold, and this stood in really stark contrast to the traditional Jewish affirmation of marriage and family. This whole theological evolution was championed by some key early church fathers, heavyweights like Origen, Tertullian, and Jerome. Through their incredibly influential writings, celibacy was framed more and more as the ideal path to spiritual purity. This shift, Phipps argues, is what created the framework where a celibate Jesus became not just plausible, but theologically necessary. But any responsible analysis has to look at the weaknesses in an argument too. And Phipps's work, as influential as it is, isn't without its critics. They point to what some have called moments of fuzzy logic. So the main critique isn't that his entire premise is wrong. It's that some of his supporting arguments can rely more on these big, sweeping generalizations than on hard evidence. Let's take his argument about Jesus's female followers, for example. Okay, so here, Phipps argues against the traditional idea of celibate female disciples traveling with Jesus. He grounds his argument in his understanding of what was culturally appropriate back then. He basically finds the whole idea laughable based on the societal norms he has established. The critique, though, is that this statement, while it's rhetorically powerful, might be oversimplifying a pretty complex social reality. I mean, it's possible that exceptions existed, right? And to just dismiss the whole idea as ludicrous might be a step beyond what the evidence can definitively support. It really just highlights how challenging it is to reconstruct any ancient society with perfect clarity. So, after exploring the argument and its critiques, we land at the most important question of all. Why does any of this matter? Especially if we can't find a certain definitive answer. At the end of the day, the goal isn't really to prove whether Jesus was married or not. The real value of asking the question is what it unlocks, a much deeper understanding of how history, culture, and religious doctrine all intersect and develop over centuries. This whole investigation really highlights how profoundly our picture of the past is shaped by the ideas that come later. It forces us to recognize that religious doctrines, especially around things like sexuality, they aren't static, they evolve. And by questioning a core assumption, we open the door to a more complex and maybe more historically grounded perspective. And that leaves us with one final thought. Phipps's work ultimately serves as a kind of mirror. It forces us to confront our own assumptions about religion, about sexuality, about history itself. It challenges us to stop and consider how the lens of our own time shapes every single story we tell about the past.